We tell ourselves a story about the brain and retirement, and it's a kind story. 40 years of decisions, deadlines, problems that woke you at 3 in the morning. And now, finally, the mind gets to rest. No more being sharp on demand, no more being on. We treat mental rest as part of the reward, right there alongside the beach in the slow mornings. But what if I told you your brain doesn't experience rest the way you do? That it never sits quietly waiting for you to need it again. It downsizes. Quietly, efficiently, it shrinks to fit whatever you're still asking of it. This isn't about working forever. It's about understanding what your brain is actually responding to, because it turns out that isn't your age nearly as much as we've all been told. It's Bill. 35 years of work behind me, retired long enough now to have made most of the mistakes I describe on this channel. And this one I'm still making some weeks. This is where we tell the truth about life after the gold watch. The stuff the retirement seminars leave out. They'll spend 3 hours showing you how to protect your money. Almost nobody sits you down and tells you how to protect the thing that lets you enjoy it. In 2010, two researchers, Susann Rohwedder and Robert Willis, published a paper in the Journal of Economic Perspectives with a title that stops you in your tracks. They called it mental retirement. They compared memory test scores across the United States, England, and a dozen European countries, places where people leave work at very different ages for reasons that have nothing to do with their brains and everything to do with tax rules and pension rules. And the pattern was hard to argue away. In countries where people retired earlier, cognitive scores in the early 60s were measurably lower. Their conclusion was that the effect was real, it was significant, and it ran in one direction. Retirement was affecting the mind, not the other way around. So that's what we're doing today. 7 things retirement does to the brain, and the specific, ordinary, unglamorous ways you can answer each one in your memory, your independence, and your relationships. Because if you found yourself standing in a doorway wondering what you came for, or losing a word you've known your whole life, and feeling a small cold thing move through you when it happens, there's a reason for that, and it is not the reason you're afraid of. This isn't a video about brain games and blueberries. This is about something deeper, and in some ways much more hopeful. What the research actually says about who keeps their mind and why. And if you stay to the end, you'll see the one finding that reframes every other one, including the fear itself. Before we start, one small free favor. If this is the kind of honesty you want more of, take a second and subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it puts this in front of the people who need it. Let's begin. Number 1. Your brain downsizes to fit the job you give it. We think of the mind like a battery. Work drains it, rest restores it, and after 40 years, the kindest thing we can do is finally let it recharge. That's the picture almost all of us carry into retirement. It's also biologically backwards. Your brain is not storing energy for later. It is an expensive organ. It costs you about 1/5 of everything you eat, and it is ruthless about efficiency. What you use, it maintains. What you stop asking for, it gradually stops paying for. Rohwedder and Willis had a plain explanation for what they found in all those countries. When people retire, their daily environment usually becomes less mentally demanding. Fewer problems that must be solved by Thursday, fewer names to hold, fewer plans to juggle, fewer moments where you have to think on your feet in front of someone. In other words, the decline they measured wasn't the mind wearing out. It was the mind being asked for less. Think of 2 men who retire from the same engineering firm the same spring. The first one has been dreaming for a decade about the day nothing is required of him, and he gets exactly that. His mornings are the news, his afternoons are the yard, his evenings are television. Nothing about that is lazy. It's what he was promised, but nothing in it is difficult either. The second man takes a part-time role 2 days a week helping a young contractor read drawings, and it irritates him, and he complains about it, and he keeps doing it. 5 years on, one of them is noticeably harder to keep up with in conversation. It isn't the one still complaining about the contractor. And notice what the difference is not. It isn't intelligence. They started the same. It isn't discipline either, which is the thing we always reach for when we're explaining why someone else declined and we won't. It's demand. And I want to say something uncomfortable about the first man because he is the sympathetic one in this story, not the foolish one. He did nothing wrong. He did exactly what he was told his whole life to look forward to. That's what makes this the cruelest small trick in retirement. The reward we were promised and the thing our brains need are pointed in opposite directions, and nobody mentions it at the party. So how do you practice this? First, keep one thing in your week that has a deadline attached to it, something where another human being is genuinely waiting on you. Deadlines force the brain to plan, and planning is the thing you just gave up. Second, protect one hard thing from being made easy. If you're going to do the family finances, do them yourself before the software does it for you. And finally, notice when a week has passed where nothing was difficult and treat that the way you'd treat a week where you never stood up. Your brain isn't a battery, it's an economy. It funds what you spend on. Number two, it was never the job, it was the demand. Now I want to be careful with the next study because at first glance it sounds like an argument for never retiring at all, and that isn't what it says. In 2014, in the European Journal of Epidemiology, a team led by the French researcher Carole Dufuy published something remarkable, mostly because of its size. They linked health and pension records for nearly 430,000 retired self-employed workers in France, shopkeepers, tradespeople, small business owners. And they asked a simple question. Does the age you retire have anything to do with whether you develop dementia? The answer was yes, and it was consistent. For each additional year a person kept working, the risk of dementia was about 3% lower. Now, if you stopped listening there, you'd conclude that the healthiest thing you can do for your brain is never stop working. And that's a miserable conclusion. And it's also not what the data means. Because a job is not one thing, a job is a bundle. It's problem solving, and other people, and a reason to leave the house, and a structure that makes you get up, and being needed, and being spoken to as someone who knows something. That's the bundle the brain was responding to. Nobody has ever shown that a paycheck is neurologically protective. Have you ever noticed how the retirees who stay sharp all seem busy in a particular way? Not frantic, committed. Picture two women who both retire from nursing at 63. The first one keeps working per diem shifts at the hospital, hates most of them, does them for the money. The second one leaves nursing entirely and starts running the volunteer schedule for a food pantry, which means 40 people, a spreadsheet, 3 crises a week, and a phone that rings. Which one has the demanding job? On paper, one of them is employed. In the brain's accounting, they both are. So how do you rebuild the bundle without the job? First, list what your work actually gave you and be specific. Problems, people, structure, status, purpose. Most of us have never once written that down. Second, replace them separately because no single hobby replaces all 5. And expecting one to is why so many retirements feel thin. And finally, choose at least one replacement that involves other people depending on you, not just you enjoying yourself. Enjoyment is good for your life. Being counted on is what's good for your brain. Number 3, comfort doesn't count. Only difficulty does. Here's where I have to take something away from you, and I'm sorry about it. The crossword probably isn't working. Neither is the Sudoku if you're already good at it. In 2014, a psychologist named Denise Park published a study called the Synapse Project, and it's one of the cleanest experiments anyone has run on this question. She took 221 adults between 60 and 90, and she split them into groups. Some spent 15 hours a week for 3 months learning digital photography. Some learned quilting on complicated machines that had to be programmed. Some were put in a social group that met regularly, coffee, conversation, outings, genuinely pleasant. And some did activities that used knowledge they already had, crosswords and puzzles and listening to music. 3 months later, she tested everyone's memory. Only the photography and quilting groups improved. Not the social group, not the puzzle group. The ones who got better were the ones who had spent 3 months being bad at something in front of other people. And some of that improvement was still there a year later. In other words, the brain doesn't respond to activity. It responds to difficulty, to the specific discomfort of not knowing how yet. But here's the thing about the crossword. It isn't useless, it's just finished. When you first learned to do them, they were hard, and they were doing exactly what quilting did for those women. Now you're good at them, and the work is over, and you're mostly enjoying a skill you already built. That's a fine way to spend a morning. It just isn't training anymore. Think of two women, both 72. One has done the same crossword in the same chair with the same coffee every morning for 11 years, and she is very good at it. The other took up the cello at 68 and is, by her own cheerful admission, still terrible. She has a teacher who is 30 years younger and who corrects her constantly. One of those women is comfortable every single morning. The other is embarrassed twice a week. Guess which one the research is rooting for? So how do you practice this? First, apply one test to any activity you're counting as brain work. Am I bad at this? If the answer is no, it may be recreation, and recreation is allowed, but don't file it under training. Second, pick something with a teacher and a next level because the whole mechanism is being corrected by someone who knows more than you. And finally, when you feel that hot flush of being the worst person in the room, understand what that feeling actually is. That's the sensation of your brain being asked to build something. It's not humiliation, it's construction. Number 4, your legs are memory equipment. We file exercise under the heart, blood pressure, cholesterol, the numbers your doctor reads off a page. Almost nobody files it under memory. And that's the single most expensive filing error in this whole video. In 2011, in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, Kirk Erickson and his colleagues published a trial with 120 older adults. They put half of them on a program of moderate aerobic exercise, walking essentially, not marathons, not weights, not anything you'd need a gym membership or a young body for. Walking regularly for a year. Then they put everyone in an MRI scanner and measured the hippocampus, the seahorse-shaped structure sitting deep in the brain that does something no other part does. It files new memories. It is also, unfortunately, one of the first structures to shrink as we age, and one of the first places Alzheimer's does its damage. In the walking group, the hippocampus didn't just shrink more slowly, it got bigger, about 2% bigger, which the researchers estimated was equivalent to reversing 1 to 2 years of age-related loss. And their spatial memory improved with that. Read that again, because we don't have many findings like it. A structure that is supposed to only go one direction went the other direction in people in their 60s and 70s on the strength of walking. It's remarkable, isn't it? Think of two neighbors on the same street. The first one bought a very good treadmill, which now holds laundry. Not because he's undisciplined, but because a treadmill asks you to exercise, and exercise is a chore you can postpone. The second one has a dog, and the dog does not accept postponement, and so she walks 2 miles every morning, whether she planned to or not, and stops to talk to 3 people on the way. She would tell you she doesn't exercise. She'd be wrong. And there's a detail in her morning that matters more than it looks. She doesn't decide to go. There is no moment in her day where walking has to win an argument against the couch, because the dog has already ended the argument. Every retiree I know who kept a physical habit into their 70s has something like that dog. A person waiting at a corner, a class that charges you if you don't show, a route to a coffee shop that's expecting you. The habit isn't held up by willpower, which is a finite and frankly unreliable substance in any decade. It's held up by something outside them that would notice their absence. That's not a weakness, that's design. So how do you practice this? First, attach the walking to something that isn't optional. A dog, a person expecting you, a newspaper you have to fetch. Motivation fails, obligation doesn't. Second, aim for most days rather than hard days, because the trial that grew hippocampi was built on moderate and regular, not heroic. And finally, walk somewhere with turns and decisions in it, a neighborhood or a trail, rather than a loop of the same track, because navigating is itself hippocampus work. You're not walking for your heart. Your heart is just the first thing that noticed. Number 5, loneliness is not only a feeling, it's a risk factor. In July of 2024, the Lancet Commission on Dementia published its updated report, and it's the closest thing this field has to a consensus document. Dozens of researchers, decades of studies all pulled into one accounting. And the headline number was this: Around 45% of dementia cases worldwide are potentially preventable by addressing 14 modifiable risk factors across the course of a life. I want to be honest about that sentence because it's the kind of statistic that gets flattened in the retelling. It doesn't mean 45% of people can avoid dementia. It means that at the population level, across a whole lifetime, these 14 things account for a very large share of the risk we can actually do something about. Genetics still matter. Luck still matters. Nothing here is a guarantee, and none of this is medical advice. But 14 things is a lot of doors, and most of us don't know their doors. And sitting on that list alongside blood pressure and smoking and head injury is social isolation, not sadness, not loneliness as a mood. Isolation as an epidemiological risk factor in a clinical document next to hypertension. We've been taught that being alone is an emotional problem with an emotional cost, and that as long as you're content in your own company, you're fine. The brain doesn't appear to agree. Conversation is one of the most complicated things a human being does. You're holding a thread, predicting where it's going, reading a face, choosing between words, remembering what was said 4 minutes ago, and suppressing what you almost said instead. There is no puzzle in any bookshop that comes close. When you stop having conversations, you stop running the most demanding program you own. Picture two men widowed the same year. The first grieves privately and thoroughly and does not want to burden anyone, and so his week narrows without any single decision ever being made. The second joins a choir 8 months in, mostly because his daughter nagged him, and he cannot sing, and he goes every Tuesday. 5 years on, one of them has a Tuesday. That is a bigger difference than it sounds. So how do you protect this? First, put people on the calendar the way you'd put a doctor on the calendar, in ink, recurring. Second, choose formats that require you to talk, not just attend. A class, a committee, a game with rules and arguments. Sitting near people is not the same as talking to them. And finally, keep at least one relationship where you are challenged, not just comforted. Someone who disagrees with you is doing something for your brain that a soothing friend cannot. Number 6, the thing you're pretending not to notice. Now, the one almost nobody expects, and the reason I wanted to make this video. On that same list of 14 factors, one of the largest in midlife is hearing loss. Not dementia's cousin, not a symptom, a modifiable risk factor for dementia, sitting there in the Lancet report in plain text. And when you understand the mechanism, it stops being surprising and starts being obvious. When hearing begins to go, it doesn't announce itself. Nobody wakes up deaf. What happens is that listening gets expensive. Your brain starts spending real effort just decoding the sounds, effort it used to spend on meaning, on memory, on the pleasure of the conversation itself. And then something worse happens, and it happens so slowly that no one in the family ever names it. Let me tell you about a man I'll call Marcus. Marcus retired at 66 from a maintenance job at a school district, and he was, by every account, the loudest man at any table. He had opinions about everything. He told the same 4 stories, and his daughter Nadine used to roll her eyes and say she could find him in a restaurant with her eyes closed. Sunday dinner at Marcus's house was 11 people and 3 conversations happening at once. Somewhere around 69, Marcus started sitting at the end of the table instead of the middle. Nobody noticed. Then he started saying, "What?" And when it was repeated, waving his hand and saying, "Never mind, doesn't matter." Nobody noticed that either, or if they did, they thought he was being agreeable. By 71, he'd stopped telling the 4 stories. By 72, he was leaving the table early to let you all catch up and washing dishes alone in a quiet kitchen, which everyone agreed was very thoughtful of him. And here's what the family said to each other in the car on the way home. He's slowing down. He's not himself. Is he getting confused? He wasn't confused. He was exhausted. He had spent 18 months straining to follow overlapping voices in a room with hard floors and no curtains. And he had lost every single one of those battles. And like most proud people, he had solved the problem by removing himself from the field. The withdrawal didn't come from his mind, it came from his ears. And then the withdrawal started doing its own damage, because a man who leaves the table early is now a man having fewer conversations. And we just spent an entire section on what that costs. Nadine figured it out eventually. And not because of anything clever. She sat next to him at a loud restaurant and watched him laugh a half second after everyone else. That half second is the tell. It's the sound of someone reading faces instead of hearing words. It took her 8 months to get him to an audiologist, and I want you to know it was not a graceful 8 months, because Marcus said what most men say, which is that everyone else mumbles. He has hearing aids now. He is once again the loudest man at the table. His daughter says she got her father back, and that is exactly the right way to describe it, because he had been leaving for 4 years and nobody had thought to ask him why. Notice what almost happened. Marcus was one family conversation away from being described permanently as the grandfather who went quiet at the end. So how do you act on this? First, if you are over 60 and you have not had a hearing test, get one and treat it exactly like the eye exam you don't argue about. Second, watch for the behavior, not the complaint, in yourself and in the people you love. Turning down invitations to noisy places, moving to the end of tables, laughing late, and above all the words, never mind, it doesn't matter. Those are not personality changes. And finally, if it's someone you love, understand that they will resist, and that the resistance is about dignity, not stubbornness. Don't tell them they're going deaf. Tell them you miss talking to them. Number 7, you are not preventing decline. You are building reserve. And this is where all of it comes together, because there's one more finding, and it changes the shape of everything I've just told you. For decades, researchers kept running into the same strange result. They'd examine the brain of someone who had died in their 90s with a sharp mind, still doing the crossword, still running the family, and they'd find it full of the plaques and tangles of Alzheimer's disease. By the pathology, that person should have been severely impaired for years. They weren't. And on the other side, they'd find people whose brains showed far less damage, who had been lost to the disease long before the end. Same pathology, completely different lives. The explanation that emerged, developed by researchers including Yakov Stern at Columbia, is called cognitive reserve. The idea is that a lifetime of education, demanding work, learning, and social complexity doesn't stop your brain from accumulating damage. It builds a deeper, better connected network, with more ways to route around the damage once it arrives. It doesn't prevent the disease. It changes how much disease it takes before your life is affected. Now hold that next to one more study. In 2010 at Rush University in Chicago, Patricia Boyle and her colleagues followed more than 900 older adults who did not have dementia. They measured something you wouldn't expect to find in a medical journal: purpose in life. Whether people agreed with statements like, "I have a sense of direction and purpose." Over the following years, 155 of them developed Alzheimer's disease. And when the researchers accounted for everything else they could, the people with a greater sense of purpose were substantially less likely to be among them. And those who did decline, declined more slowly. Purpose, the soft thing, the thing you can't buy or prescribe, showing up as a measurable difference in a clinical outcome. In other words, everything on this list, the demand, the difficulty, the walking, the people, the hearing, the purpose, none of it is a shield you hold up against the future. All of it is construction. You are not trying to keep something from happening. You are building something deep enough that if it happens, it takes longer to reach you. And that's a completely different job than the one fear hands you. Fear says protect, avoid, monitor, worry. Reserve says build, engage, learn, connect. One of those makes your remaining years smaller. The other one is indistinguishable from simply living well. And I think that's the part worth sitting with, because it dissolves a choice most of us assume we have to make. We picture two roads. On one, you live carefully, monitoring yourself, giving up the things you enjoy in exchange for a few more good years. On the other, you enjoy yourself now and take your chances. That trade is what makes people avoid this subject entirely. But look at what the research actually asked of you today. Learn something difficult. Walk somewhere pleasant. Stay at the table with people you love. Keep being needed. Have a reason to get up. There is no version of that list that is a sacrifice. Nobody reaches the end of their life wishing they had spent less of it learning things and talking to people. The road that protects your brain turns out to be the same road you'd want to be on anyway. That is not usually how health advice works, and it's worth noticing when it happens. So how do you live it? First, stop measuring your habits against the fear and start measuring them against the reserve. The question isn't, will this save me? It's, is this making me deeper? Second, do the things on this list because they're good, not because they're insurance. Since every single one of them, the class, the walk, the choir, the Sunday table, is worth having even if it buys you nothing. And finally, accept the honest limit. You cannot guarantee this. Nobody can. What you can do is make sure that whatever comes, it has to work a great deal harder to take you. So let's come back to where we started. We thought we were giving the brain a rest. What we were actually doing was telling it, in the only language it understands, that less would be required from now on. And it believed us. It always believes us. The good news, the genuinely good news, is that it will believe the opposite just as readily. Ask for more, and more gets maintained. Be bad at something, walk somewhere with turns in it, get the hearing test, take the seat in the middle of the table. Keep one thing in your week that somebody is waiting on. None of it is dramatic. All of it is construction. Your brain never wanted to retire. It only ever wanted to be needed. So give it something worth staying big for. If this was useful, there's another video on your screen right now that goes deeper into the psychology of a well-lived later life. And if you haven't already, subscribe so the next one finds you. Until then, take care of the thing that's letting you hear me.